Hello everyone, Sara here. We wanted to issue a trigger warning for the following episode, as some of the films we discuss feature sexual harassment and sexual assault. You should know also that this episode was recorded before recent protests broke out in response to the death of George Floyd, among countless other instances of police brutality and racial injustice. While this week's episode has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement or the systemic racism faced by the Black community, please know that AJFF has plans to respond to these issues in solidarity with these causes in upcoming programming. On June 25th, we will be hosting a webinar with dialogue around the film Every Mother's Son. Please visit ajff.org/inconversation for more information on how to view this very important film and register for the event. We will also have some future episodes coming up of this podcast devoted to amplifying the voices of Black artists and the portrayal of the Black community on screen. In the meantime, please enjoy our latest installment. Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF in Conversation, the podcast, where we talk about all things Jewish film. In today's episode, we are all about girl power on the silver screen, but of course through a uniquely Jewish lens.
The Atlanta Jewish Film Festival has always tried very hard to showcase women's stories and the work of women filmmakers. So there are a lot of films we could talk about today in order to explore the relationship and intersections between Judaism and feminism, not to mention the relationship between cinema and activism.
Absolutely. And the film industry certainly has a long way to go in terms of portraying diverse, complex women in front of the camera and giving opportunities to equally diverse, complex women behind the camera. Nevertheless, there are films out there for women, by women, that shed light on the issues that we face.
But the goal of these films isn't just to educate and entertain, I would think.
Well, that will be one of the central questions for this episode. Are these films trying to inspire audiences to take action in their own lives and communities when it comes to the fight for equal rights that still continues to this day?
One film that has to be a part of this conversation is Brave Miss World from 2013, which tells the story of Israeli beauty queen Lior Zaltzman, who was abducted and raped in Milan, Italy, 2 months before being crowned Miss World in 1998. But 10 years later, she's ready to talk about it and to encourage others to speak out.
Another incredibly empowering story is RBG from 2018, a documentary about the life of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Everything from obstacles she faced to get where she is today, to how she became a pop culture icon, to specific court cases that prove how long she's been fighting for gender equality in the eyes of the law.
And in Working Woman, also from 2018, Orna is working mother and main breadwinner for her family, who is also on the receiving end of inappropriate sexual advances and promotions from her boss in equal measure. The film captures the everyday reality for many working women, including their fight for safety and respect in the Me Too era.
As always, we wanted to bring someone onto the show who could really help us unravel and answer these and many more questions. With that in mind, we are so excited to welcome Lior Zaltzman, a contributing writer for Alma, my personal favorite Jewish feminist website, and she is also the associate editor for Kveler. Lior, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to kind of kick us off with a question that might be a little bit big, but I thought it was important to get your perspective on what feminism actually means to you, particularly from a Jewish perspective, and kind of what the intersection between Judaism and feminism is for you.
Oh gosh, that's a big question.
I know.
I grew up in Israel. I went to the army. Feminism was not really a thing that, we talked a lot about, because I think Israeli society has this idea of like, we all go to the army, but there is quite a bit of inequality between men and women, even in the jobs that we do. in the idea. I'm sorry if that's not so Jewish and specifically Israeli. Maybe there's a way, like I grew up very, very secular. So that is kind of my point of view. And yeah, when religion comes in, a lot of times, one of the things that surprised me once I got more and more into Israeli cinema is finding out about Haredi and ultra-Orthodox religious women filmmakers, and the idea that I think as a secular Jew, you have a view of religion and art not combining. So for me, that's a little bit how I view feminism in my very personal world where Judaism and Israeli identity intersect.
There is a huge distinction that you allude to, Lior, between Israeli identity and Jewish identity, and even within Jewish identity, there's a huge, there's progressive religious Judaism, and then there's Orthodox. I mean, it's not a monolithic thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry for taking us to that place, but the way I grew up with Judaism was very much like, oh, it's just a part of me. So I didn't go to shul. I was very reticent from being in my first experiences of going into the synagogue was being upstairs and separated from the men. And that was one of the first places where I felt like, oh, there's a division between men and women that is so physical. And so when I came to America in my 20s is when really I felt that there were so many more distinctions within Judaism and feminism within religious or spiritual Judaism that I didn't really know about or didn't actively go searching because my Jewish identity was so much not something that I really needed to delve into.
It's interesting to me that the irony of the Israeli identity is that it seems on the surface so confident because it's rooted in a very different place when you compare it to sort of the stereotypical Jewish diaspora identity of neuroses and anxiety, and the religious expression is not necessarily a key part of the Israeli identity. But I've always wondered if that is better or worse if you're trying to come to a place of sort of progressive equality. And I think for me, I remember when I was in college, I was going through the conversion process. I knew I was going to convert, but I hadn't quite settled with a rabbi. And I found myself dating an Orthodox Jewish woman, and we went to shul. And I was so insulted by having to stand there. And she's like, you can't look at us. You'll get distracted. You can't look at a woman and not, and still focus on what you're doing. And I thought, of course I can. It's just so deeply insulting to men, but also, obviously insulting to women. And I never lost that sense that there is something in ultra-Orthodox or traditional Jewish religiosity that is so deeply backwards when it comes to gender relations.
It's interesting because, so my first experience of being a woman in specifically Jewish spaces is being on the women's balcony. And anytime, and that was to me very triggering in a certain way of inequality is just this visible thing where you're so separated and you're the women's balcony is literally behind. And so when I came here and suddenly there was there are a lot more spaces where women can just be part of, the temple and just the spiritual, a visible part. It really changed my view of Judaism in a way that it opened my eyes. Speaking, going back to movies, there's this amazing movie, The Woman's Balcony, and it's all about women trying to bring the woman's balcony back into their synagogue in Jerusalem. And that then to me, I realized, oh, I have this view of this as oppressive, but there's plenty of women who view it as a joyful thing and a part of a community where they have their own cohesive identity as women in the Jewish world, So I think I'm trying to have a more, I've gone full circle, from not full circle, but I've gone from believing that, oh, here's this really oppressive thing that felt to me as a child, right? When was I going to synagogue? Usually bar mitzvahs, not bat mitzvahs, because I didn't have a bat mitzvah in the religious sense. And then, it's my personal view is not the view of women who are there on a weekly and daily basis, and for them that engagement with God is empowering. So I try to not be this is backward and we are forward,
I think you bring up an interesting point when it comes to empowerment and film and these different perspectives. I love The Women's Balcony. I think it's a great film. I know AJFF had it a couple years back as our closing night. And so I guess before we dive into more of the films that we want to discuss today, I was curious about what really defines a film as being feminist. Is it that they are inspiring this feeling of empowerment in the audience? Is it inspiring some kind of civic action or inciting something like that in the audience? I'm just curious what qualifications or qualities a film might have to have in order for us to see it as quote unquote feminist, and understanding, of course, that that definition can vary from person to person who's watching the films.
For me, there's so many layers to that question, right? As someone who looks at the behind the scenes too, is there a woman behind the film? Does it, pass the Bechdel test? Is there a woman speaking about things? But also, is it telling stories of women that shine light on certain inequalities or issues? And is there, a message of either action or really like, I think there's been a certain inequality in movies in general where we don't really value the stories of women unless they're love interests or someone to help the male protagonist go through his journey. So just the radical act, which we're doing more and more now, of putting a female director at the front, of putting a female character at the front, of not having romance be the focal point, or of showing women being together and that kind of community. That to me is already like the beginning of the feminist movie. I don't know, what do you think, Sarah? What is that to you?
Well, I totally agree. I think when you think about something like the female gaze, in film studies, which is my background, we're taught about the male gaze. We're taught that that's the lens we're seeing every film through. And it's so ingrained in us that when you see something that's from a female directorial perspective, to me, it automatically feels different. The things that the camera is taking in, the perspectives that it's focusing on in the narrative, like you say, we're telling, when a film is telling a story that is about a woman in all of her kind of complexity, whatever that means, instead of her being one dimensional. So for me, it's a visual thing as well as a narrative thing. And then when you get to documentaries, obviously, a couple of which we'll want to talk about today, it's a similar thing though, right? It's are these stories about women that are complicated and different from what we're used to seeing, and maybe it's a story about an underserved community or a person that we would never normally get to see a film about in Hollywood. And so it's that changing tide that I think is very interesting. And you do get more of that in foreign cinema, I think, and you do get more of that in independent cinema. And I think Hollywood obviously does have to catch up. Yeah.
Is empowerment a necessary ingredient here? Because I'll be honest, as the guy here who is admittedly and very humbly out of his depth in this topic, so apologies in advance. But, for me, there are films that have been held up as quintessentially feminist films. Working Woman, for example, which was written and began its production, well before Me Too, but was released as the Me Too movement was gaining steam and became kind of a signifier for that. That is a film that I have a hard time seeing the empowerment in, but I obviously do see its value in depicting something from a woman's perspective. Certainly the director, who I don't think it's a surprise, comes from a background of documentary filmmaking. And it's a subject that a lot of men would avoid, not out of ignorance, but just out of deep, we don't want to believe that it's as pervasive as it is. So I get that. And it's certainly empowering in the sense that you've got a female director behind the camera. It's just, it's not, to me, it doesn't strike me as an empowering story. It strikes me as a depressing story.
So I guess the question is, what is empowerment? And it's not necessarily like, oh, like, you're amazing, you can do this, hurrah. But also, I think when we talk about representation in movies, we talk about feeling seen and having our experiences be portrayed. And that experience in Working Woman, as very hard to watch as it is, and perhaps not in the same dramatic way, right, is an experience that a lot of women go through and that we don't really talk about, especially not in this kind of world that is maybe less interesting for film directors to portray, right? She works at a real estate firm. It's not as glamorous. It's a little bit glamorous, but she comes from a very working class background, and she's trying to rise to the top, and she's trying to change her socioeconomic. She's trying to change her family and pay the bills and put food on the table. And at the same time, she has this dynamic with someone who has so much power over her that keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And that is something that a lot of women experience in different ways in every industry. And that's an important experience to show, especially in the sense that the way it's shown is not fully black and white. And it's so hard. It's such a hard reality. And I found that the movie did it in such a good way where you were like, oh, there's so many little places where I can relate to this. And the fact that this injustice is shown on screen is important.
I agree completely. I think the reason I use the word complex or complicated when describing a narrative about a woman's experience or just a female character, everyone throws around the term, strong female character. I kind of like to stay away from that, because what I think Working Woman does really well is it doesn't just show the complexity of the situation and the gray area of what she's going through, but she, in and of herself as a character, it's such a raw, real, relatable, as you say, experience. And she grapples with it and reacts to things in that film in a way that I think so many women can see themselves in. And I think that's what's empowering, right? For me, when I watch a film, I don't just need to see a strong female character, because that's not always realistic. I need to see a woman that does cry, or that does make mistakes, or does have to go through a learning process with something, and have so many different emotions. And I think that's what this film does really well. And so it's empowering for me to see, again, 3 dimensions and not just one. And when you watch a film that's, more often than not directed by a male, from a male perspective, you often get sexual harassment or sexual abuse used as a plot device. And it creates a character, a female character, who by the end is claiming to have, become so strong because of it and come out from it. And it's not that that's unrealistic, but it's so simplified. And so when you get a female perspective on those kind of ubiquitous topics, experiences, it's it's no longer just a plot device, it's just real life. And again, I think that's what's really empowering for particularly women watching a film like that.
In a world where women's voices are not always heard, just having a woman's perspective depicted in all of its complexity is its own kind of empowerment. I get that. I was actually struck in that film by just how strangely generous it was to the quote-unquote villain. The director gave an interview where she talked about working with the actor and not wanting a traditional black hat kind of villain. She wanted him to be, in her words, she said that it's not that these are monsters, that they're people. I think her exact words were they're just people like us who do monstrous things. And so she wanted him to be relatable and charming, and she used words like successful and personable and generous, and somebody who was all of those things, but just was either not self-aware enough or not willing to face the power that he had in that situation, and therefore would go on to abuse it, which all of those things are true. It's very complicated. It's very probably true to life. But I had a hard time imagining a male director making those same choices.
The reality isn't black and white, right? A lot of people who are harassers and rapists, as in the case in this film, they show one face in this specific act, and then they're well liked in general. You know, that's not an anomaly. Like, so many stories come out now, right? This famous person in Hollywood sexually harassed me. This famous person in politics sexually assaulted me. And I'm not going to talk about any specific one, but so many women and men come out and they're like, they are the nicest person. I know them so well, and they would never do this thing. And here she is showing exactly that dynamic, but that's just not true. The nicest people are sometimes rapists. The nicest people are sometimes people who commit these acts. And I think that's important to show, no, these things aren't black and white. Rapists aren't these terrible villains. They're men that you've talked to and had nice conversations with. And that is validating in a weird way, because we're not here to put anyone on a pedestal or to say anyone is a villain and this person is a hero. But the truth is, people who commit these heinous acts can be nice people, can show one face to the world and another face when they're in the hotel room with you alone. That's the case in most places, you know, like, because how we're going to talk about Brave Miss World, right? The case of her rape is like, she went to this person. He was a travel agent. He was so nice. She got in a car alone with him. You know, you wouldn't just get alone if you didn't think this was a nice person that you could trust. And then everything turned around and she was raped, like, and it was very brutal. So I think that's important to show.
I don't know if this is it's hard for me to say whether this is because I'm a guy or not. But when I say it's hard for me to imagine a male director making that choice, part of that is because it's hard for me to look at someone who would do that and not see the monster. You know, Brave Miss World was so hard for me to watch, not because I didn't know these things happen, although certainly the scale of it, the scope of it is something that as a guy who's never been personally, you know, on the receiving end of this, I tried, you know, you don't want to think about it being at that scale. It's just hard to stomach. But these are, you can't listen to any of these stories of these women telling their experiences and not just want to puke. It's brutal. You know, even the ones that aren't quote unquote the most brutal rapes, you know, there's a sequence in the film where a victim talks about, you know, she was raped by two men. They slashed her throat. They left her for dead. You know, her story was horrific, even aside from the rape, but even just the regular quote unquote straight, you know, there was a rape. That was it. A guy raped me, and they're horrific. They're just brutal. You know, I personally cannot imagine a man who did that and think of him as a more complex human being. At that point, all I can see is the monster. I mean, I don't know how you look beyond. I mean, I'm impressed by what goes on in Working Woman from the filmmaking perspective, because again, I'm impressed by storytellers who can figure out how to make that choice, because I couldn't.
Well, something I was going to say that you just reminded me of is that's what's important about making films about this topic and about these experiences. That's why it's so important, right? We're kind of talking about, can these films educate and inspire something in audiences in terms of their day-to-day lives, and maybe there are discriminatory microaggressions that a man might see his male friends do, and after watching a film like this, you realize that it's a slippery slope and it's scarier, right? When I watch a film like Working Women, if I were watching it from your perspective, I would think, oh, this is so much more insidious, right? It could be any man, any similarly three-dimensional person with an interior life and a career and possibly a wife and all of these things that make them not a clear-cut monster. And that to me makes it scarier, and that to me would make me watch a film and take something away from it and say, you know what, there are people walking around every day with this multitude of characteristics and behaviors, and what can I do to try to keep an eye out for behaviors that are wrong, behaviors that are sexist, and understanding that it could be anyone, instead of kind of the Frankenstein monster that you'd imagine it to be when a film more realistically portrays, like, no, it really can be this guy that you thought was nice, or this guy that you knew from college, or whatever it is, and you know them as many different things, but this is just one of those things. I think that's why filmmaking of this kind is so important.
Yeah. I mean, and you also see how things like small things like him talking to her about the way she wears her hair, because the way the film is shot and really like it's really from her perspective, right? So many of the scenes with him are in these dark rooms and you see her from the back and even though you don't see her face, you can kind of feel the feeling of what happens when he tells you, oh, you should wear your hair down. And that might be, like small comments about a woman's appearance that you already know as a woman there's there's like the red light starting to flash in your head, but for men those kind of fly by.
I think, Sarah, you're right. When I think about Working Woman and contrasting it with a film like Brave Miss World numbed me at a certain point, and it's a more overtly activist film as a documentary, as a vehicle for her work around rape prevention and raising awareness around the experience of rape. It's much more overtly trying to impact its audience, I guess. I would assume that that's their intention. But you just hear these stories over and over and over again. And maybe it was because I simply wasn't able to not shut down in the face of those kinds of atrocities over and over and over. But it numbed me. It didn't have the impact at a certain point. It just sort of made me go, this is awful. And these are monsters. Which I guess is not surprising when you talk about a film that's largely from the point of view of somebody who was raped and has made activism around rape prevention, her cause, that she would come across that way, and the stories that they would highlight would come across that way. But Working Woman showed insidiousness, but it also put me in the emotional state of the woman in a way that I was not expecting. The cinematography, the way that the film is shot, is incredibly well executed. It's just, and it's not just that it's pretty. It's not trying to do that. What it's trying to do, at least what it did to me, was it made me feel the powerlessness at times. It made me feel the uncertainty. It made me feel the paranoia in a way that as a guy, I don't think I've ever felt in my day-to-day life.
It might be a can of worms here, but something that I'm thinking about now is the documentary versus narrative distinction. And I think that brings us to kind of shifting gears to RBG and On the Basis of Sex when it comes to conveying some kind of message to the audience and debating which is going to be more effective. I personally would love to talk about these two films in that way, because On the Basis of Sex, I think arguably should have reached a larger audience. It was this kind of Hollywood, very traditional biopic, and RBG, of course, being a documentary, but RBG really, really made a splash, really made the rounds. People were really talking about it. And I think the documentary does a better job actually at inspiring people and looking at this iconic figure of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and really, really portraying her in a very interesting light. And On the Basis of Sex, on the other hand, kind of, I would say it's too glossy, kind of over glamorizes or oversimplifies rather a lot of what the documentary is doing. And so I'd love to talk about those two films, kind of taking what Brad was saying about a documentary that's trying to, I think, really talk about the activism and inspire that versus a narrative film that maybe does that in a different way and for some might be more effective.
It's interesting, what we're talking about working women versus Brave Miss World. Here's a case where the movie really makes you feel a certain way that the documentary might be too, constantly banging you over the head with it, even though like these are such painful stories. And on the other hand, here is, a biopic that's a little bit too dry versus a documentary that can really give you the full like narrative arc that this one amazing woman went through, and you kind of ride along on that, and just like how she started from one place and got to the highest court on the land. And despite the fact that the reality is still not as bright, and like we have this incredible woman with these incredible achievements, and just is so inspiring. And to see her say the cases, the words that she said in front of the Supreme Court from her own mouth. And just, I think that's really powerful.
Something else that's interesting in these two films is the way the documentary does touch on the role that Judaism plays in her life, and the film, the narrative rather, it kind of doesn't. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on, we were talking about female directors, obviously, and how that's important. The On the Basis of Sex film is directed by a female, as is the documentary. But how important is it for an actual Jewish female icon like RBG to be played by a Jewish actress? Because Felicity Jones, as much as she's one of my favorite actresses, is not Jewish. And I think that's another way in which the narrative biopic version of her life story is further kind of Hollywoodized. Is that important to you? I'm just curious.
I think it is. I do think there's something about there's something so strange about talking about Jewish representation of Jewish women, in that, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg is played by this beautiful actress, and it's like her Judaism's almost not addressed and is so glossed over. And I don't know, maybe if we even felt more, there's a weird, I've been watching Mrs. America, which is actually there is a small part which depicts Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but there's all these amazing, incredible Jewish feminists. Gloria Steinem, played by Rosa Byrne, not a Jew. Bella Abzug, played by Margot Martindale, also not a Jew. Betty Friedan, played by Tracy Ullman, also not Jewish. And sometimes you're like, is the Jewishness just like a little like spice that you put on top when there's a non-Jewish actress playing this iconic Jewish figure? Or can someone really bring, the Yiddishkeit of this character is obviously very influenced by her Jewish background. And I do find that sometimes that just doesn't come through.
What is the uniquely Jewish? I mean, I ask this out of genuine curiosity because I know there is a great deal of discussion around feminism as it's understood and as it's expressed by women who are white versus women who are of color, women who don't have the same privileges racially. I'm curious, when we look at someone like RBG, what is uniquely Jewish and feminine about her? What is it that is different about the Jewish woman versus the non-Jewish woman that we would want to see in these portrayals?
Yeah, I think specifically with RBG, but also with someone like Bella, they're so informed by their Jewish upbringing, and they're so, same with Betty Friedan, to a lesser extent with Gloria Steinem, they're so informed by how being Jewish otherized them, and also by how being Jewish helped them as far as having the spiritual and the communal Jewish spaces that they had in their lives. And having an actress come from that background is, in a way, also the thought of the double, that we're talking about representation on screen versus behind the scenes. And that double representation, I think, is very powerful. To have a Jewish actress who's very overtly Jewish play a very Jewish character, I think is empowering.
Yeah, I think just to expand on that, Brad, I would say it's all about intersectionality. When you're a person of color, a woman of color, you're going to have you're going to experience different forms of discrimination, different sources of discrimination. And what that means is you might not even take your being a woman as your first primary source of discrimination. You might first experience racism and then also sexism. So if you're a Jewish woman, you might also encounter anti-Semitism in your life as well as sexism. And so it's the way all of those different aspects of your identity intersect and layer upon one another. And so I agree with Lior. I think I would like to see more Jewish women play Jewish women because it just speaks further to that lived experience.
I wonder how do I phrase this? I don't know how to phrase it. I'm just going to ask it as a question, I guess, to both of you. I mean, for me, when I watched RBG and I look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I have a son and I spend a lot of time, he's black, we're white, we adopted him. So I spend a lot of time thinking about, as he grows up, what role models do I want him to see? And very early on, I was speaking with my wife and other friends, and they made the point that you should think about more than just black role models for him. You should think about male role models, women role models. You should think about the ways in which he's going to interact with the world, because he's going to interact with different races, different religions, different genders. And I want him to watch RBG. I want him to look up to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the reason why is because she, to my eyes, she achieved all that she achieved without ever sacrificing those things which we consider traditionally feminine, which made her a woman versus just a strong person. And I've always hated the notion of the strong female character as personified by Ripley in Aliens or Sarah Connor in The Terminator, because to me they were just men who happened to have different genitalia. They did not come across as women. They just came across as masculinized characters. But RBG didn't. She talks in the film about going to law school while raising a baby, which I can't even begin to imagine. She talks about, as her mother would say, when she was confronted with these male judges and justices and the questions that they would ask and how she would guide them. And she talks about feeling like a kindergarten teacher in the film. And to me, those are all things that traditionally we think of as feminine traits. And that's so much of what's impressive, because what I want my son to think about when he thinks about women is not victims. I don't want him to think about women as men. I want him to think about women as women, and there being strength in that and something to admire and look towards as admirable, and what he wants to champion in his relationships. So I'm curious if you guys feel similarly when you look at a portrayal of someone like RBG, who is seen as a strong icon, and you contrast that with the quote-unquote strong woman character who's maybe a little more masculinized, or am I just, completely off the mark?
I think the problem is we don't let female characters be. The problem with the Ripleys of the world is that, in a sense, that used to be the only way to make a female character be able to be at the center of a movie. Now, it's not that there aren't women like Ripley, but there's a lot of different, we don't get the full spectrum. And so to see a woman like RBG, who is very shy, and that's also a thing, usually the powerful women or male idol is outspoken and whatever, she's shy, she's diminutive, she's very gentle, and she talks a lot about not being angry, which to me that's more of a gendered response. Women a lot of time can't afford to look angry because they are not taken as seriously. So that's another aspect of sexism that's kind of small and insidious, and to me that was like, oh, this is sexism. This is not just her wanting to be a woman, but this is her mother teaching her, when women are angry, they are not listened to. Whereas when men are angry, we give them the stage. So that to me was another aspect. Another aspect of RBG that I felt really important is how her dynamics with her husband and the work around the house was shown in the film, which I feel like we don't do enough in movies, like venerating that, trying to create an equal partnership. And that's such an important part of feminism, and what will change the world and empower women is like when they're in their house, how we share that division of labor. And in RBG, she and Marty really try to create a more equal marriage. And that is a really important thing, I think, to show to our children. A woman is not just a mother, and a woman doesn't have to hide her emotion and be a badass to be a valid character in film or to be heard. But also this is what an equal household looks like, so that when they go on and are partnered, they can create that space for, if there are sons and they do wind up in a heterosexual marriage, they can create that space for the women in their life.
So I agree with all of that. I think also the other reason I love the idea of showing your son RBG as this role model is one of her court cases, one of her landmark early lawsuits that you see detailed in the documentary. It's about how patriarchy and patriarchal roles hurt men as well, and just how she really, so it's not, when we think about feminism, we're not just thinking about women's rights, or we shouldn't just be thinking about women's rights. When I think about how and why more men should be feminists, I think about this court case where a man wasn't able to, he was a widower and wasn't able to be the caretaker for his son and get, he wasn't able to get the financial support for that because he was a man. And so to me, feminism is all about choice and about how we shouldn't be locked into these roles so stringently where we can't also be something else. And so that between that court case and how RBG does take care of the household and her children and her husband while also pursuing her own dreams, Lior used the phrase "not just," and I think that's what's so key about RBG. She doesn't want herself or other women or even men to be just what patriarchy prescribes for them. You can do that. You can be a stay-at-home mother if you want to, but it's the idea that you're not locked into that, or you're not locked just into that. And to me, that's what I get out of that film.
Yeah, and of course the counterpoint to all of this is, how do I phrase this? Part of us should be aspiring to a society where Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other women did not feel like they couldn't get angry, that they were allowed to get angry without facing a backlash because they were women. So there's that sort of constant tension when you're watching these stories. I love that Ruth Bader Ginsburg achieved all that she achieved without, by being a woman. She used those things, even those things which were negative and rooted in sexism, to her advantage. And she used her brain, and she achieved more than I think anyone could ever imagine anyone individually achieving. She's spectacular. But maybe we would be better off in a society where she was allowed to get angry when justices asked stupid questions at the Supreme Court.
What strikes me also about RBG is you were talking about the case where she argued about gender inequality from a man's perspective, is that so much of her early career and her early successes had to do with her selling feminism to these men who had no concept of the lived experience of women. And still, like when she talks about fairly recent cases, selling it to people who just don't understand that discrimination is a thing because they live in white, male, able bodies. And I do think, that's important to note. And the fact that a lot of time when we talk about fighting inequality, it sucks, that we have to sell it to the people in power as opposed to the people in power striving for a more equal, just society, even if it doesn't directly benefit them. And in certain cases, fighting for equality doesn't benefit white men, and that's okay, but we still should fight for it. I think there's a movie that I think about which takes place in a court place and is in a Bet Din and is totally the opposite. And Ronit Elkabetz's Get, which is all about injustices, the injustice of having to go through, divorce in a Jewish court. And that movie is so striking in the injustice of it, that you feel it so much, this injustice of like a woman trying to sell her case to these men, for these men to divorce her husband, and the way she has to just try and sell it, and she failed. Like, unlike Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she fails because here's one woman fighting for her own happiness, and her own happiness doesn't impact any of the men in that court. And then And if you saw that movie from the perspective of the husband, you would see how miserable he is and that she wants the divorce and how he is the victim. So I feel like that's another very powerful feminist movie, but it shows the other side, right? Like when a woman tries to sell her case for herself, she has to go through the lowest to debase herself so completely in order to get what she wants.
I want to ask a question that it's not necessarily about film, but as you both talk about having to convince people, I am struck, and I want to rethink something I said, which is, wouldn't we be better off in a world where Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't feel like she was not allowed to get angry? And one of the points that she made in that film is that she didn't say, she could have said, I'm a woman, I can't afford to get angry. But what she said instead was, I'm up there trying to convince these people of something, and it wouldn't have been effective to get angry. It wouldn't have been constructive. It would not have worked. It wouldn't have been persuasive to get angry. And I wonder if one of the lessons that RBG exemplifies, and something that I've certainly heard from when people talk about the goals of feminism, is this notion that masculinity is not just because you're a guy. It's a social construct of how to behave. And I wonder if you two agree or disagree with the notion that RBG exemplifies, which is it wouldn't necessarily be a better world if RBG felt like she was allowed to get angry. It would be a better world if everybody, male or female or otherwise, didn't immediately go to a place of anger when faced with stupid questions, or faced with injustice, or faced with whatever. They instead went to a place of, this is a human being, I have to convince them, I have to make them understand. How do I do that most effectively? Which it feels so wrong. But yet you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you see someone who said, no, it is frustrating. I'm sure it feels awful on some level, but it works, and it's way more effective. And it's in its own way a conviction of strength. It's an expression of the strength of argument, the strength of reason, the strength of empathy.
To me, that's a good point in this. I don't know that what we're saying is Ruth Bader Ginsburg should be allowed to be angry, because maybe that's not a thing that comes naturally to her. But I think it's fair for us to embrace anger as a response, as one of the responses to injustice, maybe not in the courtroom. And maybe that is a thing that should be looked at, not just from a woman. You're right, maybe not just from a woman's perspective, but generally. But just thinking about Larry Kramer, who passed away recently, who was a very known LGBT activist, and he said anger is an important constructive emotion, and I think a lot of people who fight injustice do believe that the desire to want things, the fight against injustice, to be proper courtroom. But I don't know that that's right in general, that is a broad statement. Sarah, maybe you have more to say.
No, I think all of that is right. I was just going to say that even outside of the realm of fighting for injustice, in my mind, feminism is not just about equal access to opportunities, but it's also equal access to emotions. And so when we're thinking about, can women access anger if they want to, if it comes naturally to them, if it serves them? And in our current society, the answer is kind of no. That women wouldn't be listened to, that they'd be viewed as bossy and so on. But the yin yang for me is that men are, again, not really allowed to show more typically traditionally feminine emotions when it serves them, when it comes naturally to them. That's what that question brought out in me, that right now we are in a place where again both sides kind of lose, because they're not really allowed to, in society, they're not really allowed to show anything that isn't prescribed to their gender as far as traditional patriarchal roles go.
Do either of you have a kind of favorite fictional character portrayal of a woman, of feminist ideals on screen, or a real life character, in a document? For me, it's clearly Ruth Bader Ginsburg in RBG. That is sort of the top of the mountain for me. But I'm curious what both of you feel like is your favorite or your ideal depiction of feminism and of a woman on screen.
So there's two answers. As far as a woman, an actual person who existed in the world, Renée Elkabetz is like one of my idols. I think she was an incredible actress. She was this really strong feminist voice, overtly feminist voice, Mizrahi voice too, right? So there's so much representation that went on with her, and she's just like majestic on screen. On the other hand, I think something that's important to talk about in we're talking about a lot of films that, aside from RBG, are kind of hard to watch and very painful. So I think I love movies that celebrate the joys of feminism. One of my favorite movies is imperfect as a feminist craft, but is almost perfect, is Une chante, l'autre pas, which is an Agnès Varda movie that's all about the fight for reproductive freedom in France. And it is just a joyous musical movie, a little long, but it's all about women supporting other women in this very free way. And sometimes, and that movie is very explicitly feminist, right? But sometimes doing that in a film, another one of my favorite creators is Rama Borstein, who does not identify as a feminist, but in the fact that she centers women in her craft and gives us these nuances. Like the wedding plan is not necessarily a happy movie, but it does celebrate, like these friendships and these women lifting each other up. Sure, it's a romance, and at the end, it is all about getting the man, but there's so much about this woman in the center of it who is just her faith in God in a weird way kind of empowers her. So to me, these stories of women that can be joyous, that can be funny, but that center women and their strive and fight to get what they want in life. And in some way, in the Agnes Varda movie, fight for justice for other women. That to me is like the ideal feminist movie can also celebrate the joys of sisterhood.
And for me, this is a tough one. There are a lot of films that came out last year by female directors, not necessarily Jewish, but some of my favorite films just from last year were female directors and showed really, really interesting female relationships on screen. I'm thinking about films like Booksmart, directed by Olivia Wilde and starring Beanie Feldstein, who is one of my favorite Jewish actresses working right now. I just think she's delightful. I loved Greta Gerwig's Little Women and the kind of modern meta spin that she put on that. And as far as the Jewish female aspect of this or angle of this, it's not necessarily an on-screen representation, but again, just one of my favorite actresses. Would have to be Natalie Portman, and I won't geek out about her for too long, but I know that she's gotten some criticism from the feminism angle, from the Judaism angle. I loved what she wore to the Oscars with all of the snubbed female directors' names on her, beautiful cape, and she got flack for that because she hasn't worked with that many female directors. And I just think that her responses to things like that are always so measured and eloquent. And I think she's, she kind of said, well, this is what the point I'm trying to prove is that I haven't had as many opportunities to work with female directors as I would like. And I'd like to change that, because the criticism she got was, this is an empty gesture. You haven't worked with that many female directors and so on. But anyway, I just love her. I think she's such a talented actress. I could geek out about her role in the Star Wars prequels, but we're not going to do that today. I do think Padme Amidala is a character that gets short shrift and is underappreciated, and that we will save for a different day. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that question, Brad.
I said it is interesting that one of the biggest feminist franchises is headed by an Israeli woman, Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman. When I saw that movie, people have a lot of criticism both for Gal and for that movie. But when I saw that movie, I was like, yeah, this is empowering. I felt really good. Here's this badass woman kicking ass. And the fact that the audience was full of women and young kids, and to have this powerful Israeli woman at the center of this amazing, huge franchise, also directed by a woman. I don't know. To me, that's kind of amazing Jewish representation. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing it up, because it would be weird to do this entire episode and not mention it for all the obvious reasons that you outline. To me, it's an interesting film because what struck me the most about it, a lot has been said about the ways in which having a female director at the helm meant that it wasn't as sexualized as it would be. And obviously, when you go to Justice League and you see the way that male directors showed both her character and her sisters in Themyscira, that has been talked about a lot. But for me, what was actually the most interesting part of Wonder Woman was the scene in the trenches when she sees suffering and all the men are kind of like, well, we can't really do anything. And she's like, to hell with that. And you see her empathy kind of actualized in a very masculine, aggressive, fight kind of way. But she is portrayed as a character whose empathy is what is driving her, which I loved, because I don't think you see that enough in action films, and you don't see that enough in superhero films. I don't know, Sarah is probably more of an expert on this subject than I.
I loved Wonder Woman. The minute you mentioned it, the scene that always pops into my head is just her traversing no man's land, which in and of itself, just the name of that in the history of World War One, it's no man's land, but she is just this fierce woman walking through it, dodging, bouncing bullets off of her with such ease. And that scene alone made that movie for me. And I couldn't agree more that that's really awesome Jewish female representation in such a mainstream light. Like, this brings us full circle to me saying that Hollywood really needs to catch up with some things, and it does still have a long way to go. But when I think of Wonder Woman, when I think of Captain Marvel or Birds of Prey, and all of the big releases that were supposed to still come out this year by female directors, Black Widow, Mulan, it's, we're getting there slowly but surely. And I think Wonder Woman really led the pack with that. And it's so cool that she is also Jewish.
Yeah, she's a badass. But and Wonder Woman also on a famous cover of Ms. Magazine, right, bringing us to Gloria Steinem and being used as this feminist icon, even when, like, maybe if you look back, she wasn't always. But just this idea of, here's this amazing woman leading us into a better world at one of humanity's World War I, one of humanity's darkest time. To me, I was thinking, oh, what if we had, thinking about women leaders, and what if we had more women leaders? I don't know. It's a more meaningful women movie than we give it credit for.
I think that's absolutely the case, and it's perhaps a wonderful message to end on. Lior, thank you again for joining us and for helping us to make sense of what is a very nuanced and in some ways fraught topic. And I certainly had a lot of anxiety about putting my own foot in my mouth, but you have helped us enormously. So thank you for being with us.
It was so great talking about these movies. This was so much fun. Thank you.
After today, I expect and I hope we'll all be watching these films and others like them with more of an eye toward what we can all be doing in our everyday lives when it comes to issues of equality.
I agree completely, and I really hope that is the case. Representation truly matters, and films really do have so much to teach us and can do so much to inspire and empower us all. Until next time, we are your hosts, Sarah Glassberg
and Brad Pilcher.
Also producing are Catherine Crosby and Chris Holland, who is also our technical director and editor, and Catherine Cole, our show intern.
Thank you again to our special guest this week, Lior Zaltzman.
The music you've been humming to all show long is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us as well as show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a line with questions, comments, and we just might answer in a future episode.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps.
And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.